in 1979. I moved back in 1989. So basically, I stayed there for about 10 years, and I was kind of part of the Silicon Valley scene for a number of those years. In addition to working, I worked with the McKinsey San Francisco office for a while. But then, of course, you know, as you might know from business history, the startup scene in the world, and of course in Norway, was pretty hot in the 80s. It was not so hot after that, because we had a financial crisis in 1987, which basically, you know, the whole startup scene was dead until it took off again around the year 2000, followed by another crash, and another crash in 2009, 2010. So basically, I didn't get involved again on the Norwegian startup scene until about 3 or 4 years ago, but I certainly have a history in it. And what I've been doing in the meantime is work with M&A. So I work with equity strategies, ownership strategies, and acquisition and divestiture of companies. That's basically what I do when I'm not involved with startups, which I spend about 30% of my time on. So that's me in a nutshell. So let's go to business. So initially, I will take you through 3, 4, 5 key slides on trying to understand, or I try to convey to you the dilemmas and the key issues involved with equity distribution and understanding basically how you should think about this, which is pretty basic stuff, but some of it's really important for you to get a holistic picture of what we're up against here. So with that's an introduction. I will switch to presenting mode here, see if I can handle this.
You can present now. It's the icon on the right at the bottom.
Yes, I know. So
perfect.
This should now work. Does it? You can see the whole screen? Right, it works?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, very good. All right. So basically, this kind of need for some initial basic understanding is based on that the questions that you supported me with during the last week represent a lot of different levels. Basically, very kind of top level questions down to the nitty gritty, and the angle of these questions were also pretty different. So there was no kind of clear pattern to it. So I'll try to, which is why I'm kicking this off by trying to provide you with some angles about how to understand this. So let's start with basically understanding basic ownership development and how you should think about it. And the reason why this is important will become evident in a few minutes. By the way, again, the slides I'll show you will be mailed to Raya just following the session. So basically what you're up against is to take your startup through 3, 4, 5 rounds of financing over a number of years. From basically the seed angel phase over to, if you're successful, kind of what is called, as you probably know, ABC round of financing. Whether it's 4 phases or 5 phases, that doesn't really matter. 2 things matter. The first thing that matters is basically in order to end up with a reasonable ownership percentage, okay, which implicitly underline many of your questions, requires some careful thinking. And one guideline for this is posted on the right-hand side of this slide, basically saying that none of your financing rounds should have a dilution of approximately more than, 12%, 15%, maximum 20%. What do I mean by that? If you have a valuation of 8 million and you do a private placement of 2 million, the ownership of that placement is 2 over 10. 2 over 8 plus 2, 2 over what you end up with, 20%. If you have 3, 4 rounds of financing after each other, and you go higher than that, you will be very strongly diluted ownership-wise, which is not to be recommended. Hence, the guideline of maximum 15 to 20%. I try to keep private placement or equity rounds around 50% or a little above 15%, no much more than that. If you turn to the left part of this slide, the key consequence of this, if you follow this guideline, is that if you start out with a 10% ownership, It doesn't matter if we say 15% or 20 or 30. It's a scalable. I'm just providing you with the principle here. Your 10% will go down to approximately 4% at the end of these financing rounds. Okay. If you do a lot more than 15% dilution in each round, your ownership percentage at the end will be much less than that, which is not advisable. So the trade-off between how much money to take in, where the point, of course, is to have enough cash for a reasonable runway, versus the dilution over time, is optimized, in my experience, optimized around 15%. Whether it's 14 or 16 or 17, it doesn't matter. Don't do it by 30% rounds. Don't take in 5 million in capital if you have a valuation of 10 million. That's 33%. It's much true. It can work in one round, but over several rounds, it will not work. What can this be used for? What's the point of all this? Well, the point is to be able to predict how incentives can be structured, and that comes the interesting part. But keep in mind what I just said. So on the right-hand side here first, this dilution rule that I just provided you with is very effective in terms of understanding how monetary incentives can be designed. So I have a startup. I model the market. I think it's reasonable to assume, just to have a scalable number, that within 5 years I can create value of 100 million. Let's say that. Okay. Now, if I'm going to provide somebody with an incentive of 1 million kroner at that exit, right? That represents 1%, right? 1% of 2 million. Got it? So basically, based on this rule, to the upper left here, that means that you have to start with 2.5% ownership, because 2.5 times 0.4 goes down to 1%, and 1% of 100 million is 1 million. So I have a design mechanism here. I can say that, okay, if I need a CTO, maybe I need to design an incentive of 5 million over 5 years, 1 million a year, okay? Then I can go back and I can reconstruct this to end up with what kind of ownership percentage does that imply in the beginning? The answer to that, based on the example I just gave you, is 12.5%, because 12.5% times 0.4 is 5%, and 5% of 100 million is 5 million. So this is the reason that this makes a lot of sense in terms of understanding ownership development on the top section here. But the real value of it, when it comes to incentive mechanisms, to understand how you can translate monetary incentives at exit time with percentage ownership at startup time. That's the whole point. And another thing you will probably hear me say a lot of times, it's very typical that all startup or founders think in terms of percentages. Stop that. Cut that out. It's totally, because valueless. Start thinking about amounts. When you design incentives, you should think in terms of amounts. What do I need to have for a chairman per year? What do I need to have for a CTO? What do I need to have for myself, for that matter? Translate that into money over time, and then use those amounts to go back and translate it into percentages and ownership structure based on these guidelines. It all hangs together. So this is very useful if you manage your equity placement in a proper way. The proper way is not to have 30% dilution rounds. It's to have 15 to 20%, after which you will end up with this type of ownership after a number of financing rounds. Okay, so that's basically the first building block, basic building block about how to understand equity distribution, how you can calculate it, run numbers on it. So a couple of examples on the bottom here. So I just mentioned that before. So if you with 100 million long-term valuation target want to create a 2 million kroner ownership value for somebody, you need to start with approximately 5% ownership. That is if you have a valuation of 100 million. If you go for, say, like, no, my startup could maybe be worth 200 million over 5, 6, 7 years. Then to create a 10 million incentive, you need to start with 12.5% ownership. If you run the numbers, you'll see that. Okay. Not commonly known, not commonly used. In my experience, extremely valuable way to run the largeship. So that was basic guideline number 1. Basic guideline number 2. Many of you have asked about how should you think about ownership and the source of shares. Should they come from new shares, meaning that everybody's diluted in the same percentage-wise? Should they come from founder shares? How should you think about that? There are no kind of fixed rules about this either, but there is a logic, at least for me, that I'm using quite a bit, and usually I kind of get it the way I want it. Don't misunderstand me. In terms of this logic that I'll present you with it. So my recommendation is the following. Think about the startup team consisting of 3 roles. Whether the team is complete or not when you start out, that's irrelevant. Think of a basic founder team with 3 roles. Somebody's going to run it, that's the CEO, of course. Somebody's going to be responsible for the technology and the architecture, that's the CTO, of course. And you will need a key commercial resource. Chief Growth Officer, Chief Commercial Officer, Chief Marketing Officer, whatever name you want to put on it. If your founder team is not complete, then basically the shares related to the missing key person should come from founder shares, not by dilution. Okay? The other ownership for people not in the founder team, general incentives, maybe you want incentives for the board, chairman, whatever, maybe an advisor, certainly for some of the key people coming on board over time. That's general incentives, which should come from new shares, meaning everybody will be diluted, which is illustrated here. In the mock-up documents for shareholder agreements that you've probably seen at the factory, and incidentally it was written by me, there is reservation for ESOP plan, employment stock option plan, which is the acronym for ESOP, of generally, I think it says between 6 and 10%. So some of you ask how large should such a plan be? Well, less than 10%. It's a good idea. 8% is a good number, as I say here. Some ESOPs are 5%, some are 6%, some are 10%. That's kind of the right thing to shoot for. So what can this be used for? It only sounds like words so far, but it can be very practical. So let's assume that the company has 100,000 shares, right? And for that matter, let's assume that the valuation is 10 million, just to have an easy dividable number. So basically that means that the price is 100 kroner per share, because 100 times 100,000 is 10 million, right? So how should you think about this when you negotiate with investors? The first principle is you're lacking the CTO, for instance. So, okay, based on the monetary argument that we just talked about 5 minutes ago, maybe such a CTO should be provided with 20,000 shares. Could make sense from a monetary point of view, from an incentive point of view. We'll get back to that. Those shares for the person who is not yet on the founder's team should, in principle, come from the founder team shares by redistributing the 100,000. So maybe based on that, you could say to the investors that no, the shares to that person will not come from dilution. It will basically come from existing shares, and we'll do it by reshuffling the shares between the other 2 people that are already on board. To be able to do that, you obviously need to have discussed that beforehand, ref the importance of a founder team agreement and all that kind of stuff, because we'll come back to that. So that's one way to do it, one way to think about it. There's another way to think about it, which basically has the same effect, and that's to do it by pricing instead. So basically, what I'm saying here is that, hey, instead of redistributing these shares, we can take it from new shares, but then we basically have a virtual ownership not of 100,000 shares, but 120,000 shares. Because the last 20,000 has not been issued yet, but that's irrelevant. So you go to the investors and you say that, okay, we have 100,000 shares, but we have reserved 20,000 shares to the coming CTO. Therefore, we price this venture not at 10 million divided by 100,000, but 10 million divided by 120,000, which will take the issue price at the private placement down from 100 to 83. Same effect. It's not taken from dilution. Well, it is taken from dilution, but the price is reflected correspondingly. It doesn't hurt the investors. You got that? So this is my recommended way of thinking about it. Again, back to you design the incentives, not based on percentages, you design it based on money, monetary incentives. You implement it in a not complete team, either by taking the shares from existing shares among the founders, fair and straight, or you do it by issuing new shares. But if you do it by issuing new shares, you take down the pricing to reflect that, so it becomes fair for everybody. Once you've done this, once you have the complete team, then you start issuing shares or options, for that matter, for everybody based on the principle in the which lies embedded in an incentive plan, again called an ESOP, employee stock option plan. Hopefully that was kind of a little clear in terms of how to think about that. You can wait. You don't have to do it this way, but sooner or later, somebody who thinks fairly clearly about this will come along, for instance, me, and say that, hey, you can't just assume that everybody will pay for people you don't have on board. You don't know what kind of incentive this will be. You don't know what kind of dilution it shall be. Basically, you don't have a pricing on your venture because you don't have a denominator. You say 10 million valuation, but how many shares should these 10 million be distributed among? And you don't have an answer to that. And you will basically, you will scare that investor off, at least if it's somebody with reasonable financial experience. So I recommend that you do it up front, that you go through that thinking, you hopefully understand why it's fair, why it's reasonable, and start thinking that way, distinguishing between ownership of the founder team and the source of that ownership versus the ownership of the kind of line management team once it's up and going, or board for that matter, and say that is different. Those shares will be new shares that will be included in the plan, which will dilute everybody's ownership. And if you state that in a shareholder agreement, which I did when I wrote the one for the factory, there's nobody to hide, no place to hide. You will own it because you signed that document, and the investors will also know it because it says it's being signed in that document. So nobody can come and protest afterwards. It's all there, say that we will have an incentive scheme. It will be in the order of magnitude, like this. So that's what you signed on to. Okay? That was the second kind of basic principle. The third one, and some of you, many of you have talked about this, about how shall I provide the shares? These mechanisms called vesting mechanism or opptjening in Norwegian. How should I think about that? Yeah, that's a good question, and there are some important lessons and some important degrees of freedom regarding that I want to provide you with here. So the key question is, how should I distribute incentive shares over time? Well, you should do it over time, because ownership, in the sense we're talking about it now, for instance, ownership to a CTO, is payment for the future, not for the present, right? You want this person to be on board, for instance, at least 3-4 years. Therefore, you want to be able to distribute the ownership over 3-4 years. What should be the criteria for that vesting? Can be anything. Usually, Let's see if I can get this thing to move. Usually it's done just by time, meaning just by the calendar passing by. That's not the only answer. You can do it by results. You can do it by events. Also, things happen. When this happens, you get so many shares. There are no rules for this. You can design it whatever in whatever way you want, and the way you want it might be strongly reflected by things that are critical to you. And to go in and ask that question of what is critical to me, and based on that, shall I do it in a different way than only by timing? That's a perfectly good question to ask yourself. And the answer can be anything. Another interesting aspect of this is whether this vesting should be linear, meaning that you have exactly the same number of shares per unit of time, if it's done over time or not. Most of these plans are linear in this sense, and even the one I put into the shareholder agreement that's underlying the factory, which was actually that paragraph I took from the Startup Labs SHA plan, is linear. Personally, I'm not very in favor of linear investing. You think about it. You have a CTO, you have a 3-year period or a 4-year period. After 50% of the time he has 50%, after 75% of the time he has 75%. Well, that is a pretty strong incentive to leave, actually, if you think about it. Because you, after half of the time, 2 or 4 years, you actually have 50% of the incentives. There are other ways to think about this. So I usually, I call this my Yahtzee function, because everybody remembers that 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 equals to 10. It's called a small straight thing in Yahtzee, part of that logic. And that's a pretty useful thing to think about, because if you think about this now according to years, so first year 10%, second year 20%, third year 30%, and fourth year 40%. That adds up to 100%, right? Maybe that's the smart way to do it, because that means that actually after 3 years, there is a strong incentive not to leave, right? Because I get 40% of the total I get to the 4th year. So couldn't that be a thing to think about? Of course you can. So on the right-hand side here, I have just sketched out 2 different kind of stock vesting principles for a CTO. So let's say that the CTO should get 12,000 shares. There's no percentage here, folks. There's monetary logic behind this. I've been thinking about this. I don't even know how many shares this company has. But I've said that, okay, this guy should maybe have an incentive of X million over time. I translate that on a piece of paper in my spreadsheet to 12,000 shares. So that's why it says 12,000 shares. I have no respect for percentages in this regard, only for the kroner behind it. So 2 alternative plans, okay? One is I call non-linear. Okay, well, I put this guy in a trial period for 6 months. If you're a founder, that's not reasonable. But if the guy is a non-founder, I would recommend it. I've been exchanging CTOs in a few startups over the last year for good reasons, I might add. And not to have a trial period is playing with fire, as far as I'm concerned. So if you can do it, do it. So obviously, then there's no logic in giving any shares before the trial period is through, right? Because you don't know if you're going to hire the guy permanently. So the logic here can be, okay, after the trial period, then you get 10% of the quote, or meaning in this example, 1,200 shares, right? 10% of 12,000. Then after a year after that, he gets, get in the meaning of permanent ownership. We'll get back to that in a second. Another 20%, you're up to accumulated 30%, right? Then after 12 months after that, another 30%. Then you have accumulated 60%, and the last 40% in the fourth after the third year, 12 months after that again. So that would be kind of the Yahtzee principle applied to ownership vesting. Of course, I can do it by in a linear way, which many of the startup labs startups are designed by. Meaning, in this case, you know, if you have 3 years equals 12 quarters, that's 1,000 shares per quarter. So you can say for each quarter you stay on after the either right away or after the trial period, you have permanent ownership of 1,000 shares, meaning 1/12 of it all, and it will accumulate linear over these 3 years. 2 basic ways to do it. My tendency would be to get nonlinear vesting into your thinking whenever you can. And you cannot always do that. Obviously not with founders. Well, actually, you can do it by founders too. Meaning that investors will require some kind of a vesting for founders in exchange for putting money into your startup. But it's not highly typical. Then there's something called reverse vesting, which is exactly the same, just as the name applies, reversed. You give the guy or the girl, the shares right away. You say, here are the shares, but you don't own them yet. You own them according to this formula up, or these principles up here. So basically, if you leave, you're required to sell them back. That's what's called reverse vesting. If you think about it, it's easy to translate one into the other, so it's pretty trivial stuff. But the effect will come out exactly in the same way. So if somebody leaves after a year, you have maybe only given them 10%. You know, if this guy here, take the top example, he will get nothing basically during the trial period. Only 10% after that, up to month 17, right? Because 6 months plus 12 months. So basically, if he leaves after 17 months, he will only have 1,200 shares, permanent ownership. See that? After 19 months, he will have 30%. It's because he gets another 20% just by passing month 18, including the trial months. Okay, so that's the point. If you have to change your CTO, you still have available basically the same shares, which is, of course, is the whole point of this. Reverse vesting, get the shares up front and then having to sell them back if you leave. This is for tax reasons. We'll come back to that in the next kind of subtle guidelines. But it's for tax reasons, so it's no more than that. You could do it by options accumulating from the bottom up, or you could do it by reverse vesting, give the shares and then going top down. It's just two practical ways to do it, depending on the tax situation. The point of vesting schemes is to have available the shares if the person leaves. Because if you don't do that, well, you will have to add the new shares to the company, and that will mean dilution, as we started out by talking about, right? So your own ownership, if you have 40% ownership, and you have to issue 10% more shares because your CTO left, then you didn't think about this. Your own ownership by the new 10% will go down from 40 to 36% by 10%. You don't want that, which is the reason why you have vesting schemes. And again, for reasons that are pretty obvious, I recommend non-linear vesting when you can do that. So that was basically my trial. I'd give you some basic understanding of vesting schemes and why they're important and what you can do about it. The fourth and kind of final kind of basic building block of this is to understand, which I know many of you are concerned with, the tax regime and the tax regime in Norway concerning ownership and options and all that kind of stuff. How should we think about this? Yeah, we'll get to that now. The first thing I'd like to say is that, just so you know it, the tax regime in Norway is pretty liberal. We're very good at complaining about it, but we shouldn't. It's pretty liberal and it's pretty good. Also regarding startups, I mean, Norway has more millionaires per capita than the United States has. So does Sweden. So there's nothing wrong with the tax regime here, and we shouldn't be afraid of paying taxes, basically. So, and what we talk about basically on the different schemes is the difference between capital gains tax, which is what you get if you own something for a long time and then sell it. The profit of that, if you are subject to capital gains, is 22% currently. It's been going down over the last years from 27, 28 to about 22 or 22. Then there is employment tax, which is basically for most people it's a subject, but it's usually about twice of that, in between 30-35% and up to the upper 40s, depending on how much money you make, basically. So the difference is about 20 percentage points. But for that also, just you know it, you get your pension comes out of that. So when pensions in Norway are structured the way that pension points build up according to how much money you report on your tax returns, and the capital gains doesn't go into that. So if you only make money by capital gains, you will have the minimum pension when you get to the point where you want to think about that. Just to understand the system a little bit, okay? All right, so let's go back to incentives and how they're taxed. And this is not such a complex theme as many of you think. It's basically pretty simple. And maybe I've simplified it too much. But and this slide has a lot of text, but you can read it afterwards. But it's not very complex. So principle one, you buy the shares. Okay. This section up here, the two first paragraphs is related to buying shares. Your CTO is going to have a package of 12,000 shares. He buys them. If you buy shares, you own them, provided that you paid the fair market price for them. We'll get to that in a second. Then, as I mentioned before, the future tax bill when those shares are sold again at exit is 22%, not of the nominal value, but of the profit. So if you bought them at 100 and you sell them at exit at 200, the difference is 100. You pay 22% of that difference of the 100. That is paid at exit or at the point when the shares are sold, provided that the shares are bought at fair market value, which is, of course, the dilemma we're getting into here. So if it's not provided at fair market value, the difference is an employment benefit, which is what everybody tried to avoid. Okay? There is a catch to that, or there's a comment to that, and that is that, as you know, basically all shareholder agreements have lockup periods, sales restrictions, vesting schemes. You don't really own the shares. If you buy them at market value, you surely own them because you pay the same as investors did. But that's not what we're talking about usually. You buy them for a discount. That is why we have vesting schemes, because we're providing a benefit for the future. Okay. The point is, what I want to mention is that because there are sales restrictions and vesting schemes, it's fair to say that a certain discount can be provided when you buy shares anyway. and I've been around discussing this with lawyers, and they say that basically based on their experience, this is not written anywhere, a fair discount based on sales restrictions are in the order of 25 to 30%. So if your share price is at 100, you can sell them to employees for about 70 without any tax implications based on this principle. But if you go below that, you're transferring value to the employment at the time you're doing the transaction, which is taxable. And that's the first principle. Uncomfortable, maybe, but the benefit is that if you pay tax at that point, there is capital gains tax in the future, because you did pay the fair price. Take the example, just the 100 again. So the market price is 100. You have the discount at 30, which takes it down to 70, and you sell case one. You sell these shares to the employee at 70. No benefit, right? And the 70 becomes the cost at exit. So at exit, you're not taxed for the first 70 kroner, you're taxed for the profit above that, right? Now, if you transfer the shares to the employee at 50 rather than 70, there's a benefit of 20, right? So those 20 is then salary, basically, with the same consequence as salary at that point. But when you sell them again, basically, again, the cost is also based on the basically the same amount. So you also there you get the capital gains tax. You had a disadvantage in the beginning, basically paying an employment benefit, but when you sell them, the shares many years later, you pay capital gains. Maybe complicated, but I don't think so really. You understand? It's very logical. Now, with options, many people complain about that, but there is really no reason to complain about how options are taxed in the sense that it's pretty liberal. I mean, you can write an option agreement with an employee, and it doesn't matter, how you write it. It's not taxed. It is not taxed. If the market price was 100, and the strike price, as it's called, on that option is 1 kroner par value, doesn't matter. You have a 99 kroner benefit at the time you write the option. It's not taxed. Whether you have 1 kroner, 10 kroner, 50 kroner strike price, it doesn't matter. It's not taxed at that time. And that is important because you can then use that to design any type of monetary incentive you want, right? If you want to give somebody a monetary incentive of 50 kroner at the market price of 100, you can write the option with a strike price of 50. 1 share at 50 is a benefit of, right? If you want to do it, you can also write 2 shares. I can give you option for 2 shares at 75, right? Because that is also a benefit of 50. So because it doesn't matter from a tax point of view at that time, you can design it any way you want. The point is, of course, there's a flip side to that, and that's when you exercise the options, basically saying, now I want to buy the shares, and then sell them, then you're taxed. But then you're not taxed at capital gains, but you're taxed at the employment percentage, whether it's being 30 or 40% or whatever. And the reason for that is you didn't pay for anything when you got it. You didn't pay for that when you got it. So the benefit comes at the later stage, and because you was an employee, it's taxed as at employee rates, which, as I mentioned, is about 20% higher for most people than the capital gains tax. But there are benefits. You don't have to pay any taxes up front, so the liquidity is no issue. And once you pay your employment taxes, which you hopefully will do after you sell the shares, after the exit, which is important, then you have the benefit of this going into your pension calculation, which capital gains does not. So that was a long, basically, theme on option taxes, but it's important that you understand these mechanisms a little, basically, so you can do your own reasoning around it. Due to this tax regime on options, as I mentioned here, it's very important that option agreements to employees should last until exit. Why? Because at exit, you can declare the option, exercise, and sell the share at the same time. If you exercise the option and there's a market value on the shares, you will be taxed right away, which is not a good idea if you can't sell the shares, right? As a consequence of that, option agreement should be long enough to be able for the recipient, the employee, to sell the shares at the same time you use the option. That solves the liquidity issue in terms of paying taxes, which you will have to pay the year after that. Okay. So basically, this is the stuff I have mentioned as practical examples on the right-hand side here. If you're doing option agreements with or incentive agreements with independent contractors or suppliers or maybe people on your board, for instance, that has a company in between, it's not so clear case. It's not so clear case actually, and it's very hard to kind of get a definite opinion about will these incentives, option incentives, be taxed as with employee rules or not? Very hard to answer that. It depends on the closeness to the company. So there's a certain probability that you will never see any employment tax on such benefits, but nobody can know. It depending on how you declare your taxes and how if the authorities look you in the cards or not. Okay, so another kind of a final comment on this theme that I'd like to provide you with is, many use this thing with suppliers that, okay, but you can just invoice me for an amount, and then we'll basically convert that amount to shares. Fine, nothing wrong with that, but just be a little careful when you suggest that or if you use that. So when that happens, the supplier, your consultant, whatever, invoicing you with these 100,000. Firstly, we will have to put VAT on that. So that means that that's a bad idea towards you, the startup, if you have not been VAT registered. If you are registered with VAT, those 25,000 on top of the 100 will be provided to you from the authorities because it's negative VAT, and then you can use that cash to pay those 25,000 to the supplier. But if you're not VAT registered, those 25,000 will come in addition. The other thing is that for the guy who does the invoicing, he will be taxed on the income of the 100,000. So whether he gets shares or not is totally irrelevant in terms of the income being created, right? So he will have taxes, personal taxes if it's invoiced from a person, or corporate taxes, that is the 22% again, if it was invoiced from a company. So what you can use this for is to basically, for instance, if your supplier is not aware of that, you can say, okay, that conversion to shares is maybe a good idea, but wouldn't it be better if you, for instance, converted 75% of your invoice, not 100%? Because then you have a little cash reserve, which we can, by the way, pay you next year to pay for your own taxes, which will come as a result of invoicing those 100,000. Maybe I made this a little more complex than I needed to, but this is basically the story about taxes related to incentives and stuff like that. So, lesson 1: don't be scared of options. The rules are pretty liberal, and I think it's actually quite okay. Not always, of course, but in a lot of cases. And don't be too concerned with optimizing things according to taxes. Focus rather on building your company and not worry too much about it. There are a lot of some creative schemes around. Yeah, and there are some more to the story than this. There are other more creative ways to do it if you absolutely is so necessary to avoid these extra 20%. But you are getting something in return. And personally, but that's my personal opinion, I've been living in a number of other countries, by the way. I don't think the Norwegian tax system is anything to be scared of. I think it's pretty efficient, actually, in terms of what you get in return. But that's up to you to decide. Okay, so basically, these 4 chapters of the basic building blocks is what I wanted to provide you with. And I picked out, before we take the Q&A, which hopefully Raya has been sorting, I will go through some of the questions that you posted prior to the session and take you through some quick answers to some of them. One of the question was, can a company acquire own shares? I've heard that you cannot do it in Norway, but you can in the United States. No, that's not true. You can do it in Norway. You cannot issue shares in Norway, which are not in the United States. You can authorize shares, and the board can then sit on its own shares right away. That you cannot do in Norway, but you can acquire own shares, which is very important, because if your CTO leaves again, right, based on the vesting schemes, you want to buy those shares back. He had only vested 50% of the 12,000, so the 6,000 you buy back, and the company buys them back. Can they do that? Yes, they can. The way you do it is that you get a proxy from the shareholder meeting. It's a standard formulation, and then proxies and register in the company register in Brønnøysund, and then you can do it. You can buy own shares. You have to have, accounting-wise, if any company buys its own shares, it has to have capital to do that. And that's measured according to what is called the free capital above the share capital. So if you have a share capital of 100,000, but your total capital is only 130,000, you only have 30,000 of free capital. That's only that amount you can use for acquiring your own shares. If you think about it from a creditor point of view, that's pretty obvious. Because if you're going into your share capital based on the illusion value, virtual value of buying your own shares, that's not good for creditors. So that's the reason for that rule, which makes a lot of sense. Yes, so that's the question. That's the answer to that question. Portions of share to CEO. Many of you ask that. Yeah, it's not really a meaningful angle, which you understand now by having listened to me for 45 minutes. Think money. Don't think percentages. That's not all to be said, because a professional investor also looks for a fair balance. Why is that important for investors? The reason for that is not that we're so concerned with fairness. It's because we know that one of the really tough things to look out for is quarreling, heated discussions, the feeling of being treated unfairly in the founder group. That can truly destroy a company very quickly, and can be the death sentence very quickly. Because if you lose kind of 2 years of development because the founder team break up over an ownership discussion, not good. That is the reason why professional investors look for a fair balance. What is a fair balance? We'll come back to that in another question. But think money, not percent. One of the questions was, how about control? How much equity should a CEO have in order to control the company? Yeah, it's not a meaningful question either. Sorry about that. Because you will have dilution. And I explained that in the beginning, right? We're going from, if you started with 50% of the company, you will, using that guideline, end up with 20% of the company after several rounds of financing. So that was obviously a lot less than 50%, which is the kind of controlling ownership percentage under Norwegian shareholding law. And the point here is that control, in the sense of ownership control, is in a startup is not really a matter of the percentages per se. It's a matter of how the formulations in the shareholder agreement, the SHA, as you probably now becoming familiar with this acronym, how the SHA discusses ownership control. How is the board set up? Is it elected based on pure ownership, or is it elected based on other principles, such as the financial investors having 2 board members and the founders 2, for instance? That is meant to regulate control. Same regarding exit management, how the company is to be sold, if it is going to be sold. The formulation in the SHA relating to drag clause, as it's called, medsalgsplikt på norsk. That certainly has a lot to do with control. So basically, I wouldn't think about control in the conventional sense. In order to understand what kind of control you give up for getting money in, the right thing to do is to think about what formulations are in the shareholder agreement, or what formulations should be in the shareholder agreement. And then, of course, you need to select the right investors. I mean, not investors that are going to quarrel with you, investors that you are aligned to, that listens to you, and you listen to them, so they become partners, not adversaries. So that's my recommended way to think about it. Is there something to be said about ownership structure guidelines? Yeah, there is something to be said about it, and it's we're back to the issue of fairness again, and things like that, and monetary incentives. But there is a little more to be said about it. At least I can say that ideally, ideally, you know, after the seed angel round, the founder team, all of them, all three, also meaning the third person that isn't there yet, should have, you know, 75–80% of the ownership would be ideal. You have no passive investor. There's not your uncle, you know, which you handed over, or your wife handed over 30% ownership. That's not ideal. She's not on the team. She just has it. Not good, because though that is basically depriving incentives for other future members. It's not ideal. It's to be accepted in some cases, and I have accepted it in some cases, but it's not ideal. The balance between the founders team, between like a factor of 1.5, is kind of ideal. What I mean by that is if somebody has 40% ownership, nobody has less than 20. Whether it's 19 or 18 or 22 doesn't matter, but you get my point. You know, to have one person have 60 and the other have 8, it's not ideal. It can work, but I will be skeptical because I'll think, you know, that might create some hefty discussions over time, and if that results in the potential breakups in the team, not good. So no absolutes here, but that's my guideline. Some of you asked for AB shares. I know that somebody is going to be provoked, but what I'm saying now, but you should be very careful with crowdfunding. The reason why I say that is nothing to do with the funding. It has to do with the types of shareholders you get. The link between this and AB shares is that usually what B shares mean is that you will have shares without voting rights. Why do you use shares without voting rights? To get rid of the voting bureaucracy created by a tail of very tiny shareholders. That's what you get when you usually get when you do crowdfunding. So be careful with it. There are 2 ways to solve that. If you really want to do crowdfunding and you want to solve the problem with it, there are 2 ways to do it. One is to use AB shares. That's why I was linking these 2 themes to each other. The other one is to have a so-called feeder companies. We have to take all the small shareholders, put them into a holding company, and that holding company owns 12% of your startup, and then they have 45 shareholders within that holding company. That's another way to solve it. Is this an effective way of handling a large mass of small shareholders? It's the only way of handling it. These 2 ways are the only way of handling it. If you can avoid it, don't do it. If you have to have it, then implement one of these 2 ways to do it. Will it scare away investors? Sometimes. But they will be much more scared if you haven't done any of these 2 things. Then they will probably say, no, thank you. I really don't want to invest in a company with 150, people that put in the 4,000 kroner each. They will not like a structure with AB shares, but sometimes they will accept it. And they themselves, of course, will not buy B shares. They will buy A shares, which is the reason why I implemented it in the first place. So I know that I'm provoking some people with these kind of, but I've been paid in large companies fairly large amounts of money to get rid of small shareholders because it was totally inconsistent with the future ownership of the company. So take it seriously. If you have to do it, but then use either AB shares or use feeding company structures. Last question before we take the general session. One of you had an example of, I think it was original founder 30%, me 20%, reserved 50% to a CTO. Great. No, I don't think so. There might be very good reasons why you think this way, but remind what I said earlier. That is not the typical structure I would look for. It's more like 20-30-20 or 20-30-15 or something like that. There might be good reasons for doing it in the way you sketched out, but it's not. It's certainly not consistent with some of the other principles that I sketched out here. So that was. We still have 28 minutes left. So that was basically what I wanted to give you as a background for kind of maybe answering your own questions, and certainly to post new ones. So now I will stop the sharing here, and Raya, you will handle the Q&A.
Yes, and thank you, Ketil. That was super insightful, valuable, of course. And I guess that we have some questions from many. So I will start with, since I see that not many have posted questions, maybe the best way will be to invite each one to jump into the conversation. So unmute yourself, put your camera on, and ask your question directly to Ketil. Knut, you can start. Are you here, Knut? Okay. So can you see, Ketil, can you see his question on the chat? For some reason, I cannot hear you. Okay. Yes.
That's because I forgot to put on my mic again.
Okay.
Yeah, if we're just doing it like this and I'm going through the questions in the chat, I can certainly comment them in that
Yes,
sequence.
let's do that then.
Yeah. Yes, I can. On the shareholder agreement side, we have the description given there. If you're thinking about option agreements, for instance, yeah, I have documents like that. But we haven't made a standard option document for the factory yet, actually. But if Inger or Raya wants to add that, then we can certainly do it. Of course, some of the decision principles here is not relevant for an agreement text, but option agreements are certainly relevant. So yeah, I can help with that.
Thank you. We can collect some documents and send them to everyone who attended this event.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, sure, we can do it. Or we can make an inventory of documents available for the factory, and people can pick. We have Norwegian option document, English document. Simple, complex. There are different versions of this. So, yeah.
Okay, we'll do that. We have a question from Marika. Just a detail. What are the tax benefits of reverse vesting? If you already covered the question, you can maybe just give a short summary.
Yeah, the benefit of reverse vesting is if you have a low valuation at early stage, your valuation is going to go up over time, right? So it's going to be, this year it's so much, next year it's hopefully going to be, for instance, 40% higher, which is a good guideline, by the way. Doubling the value each 2 years means a little over 40% per year. So if I gave you 10% now and 10% next year the market value has gone up, and then I have a tax problem with that, right? If I gave you shares now at 100, and the true value was 100, and next year the true value is 150, and I give you shares next year at 150, it'll be a problem. The price will go up for each year. So the benefit is that if I give you all the shares to you up front when the value is low, basically you own them, and the fact that you sell them back is not relevant for tax reasons. But then you get capital gains on the initial price, which was the lowest at the time you got them all. So that's basically, hopefully that was explainable in terms of answering that question.
Thank you. Next question is from Ivan. Can you say something about exit clause, meaning if an employee leaves and we would want that employee to sell her shares back? What's fair market practice?
Non-vested shares are sold back at cost. So basically, we have a vesting scheme. I bought the shares at the par value, 1 kroner. And I leave after a year, and I had 1,000 shares, and I only vested 100 of them, meaning I've deserved the first 100 because I stayed for the year. The 90 shares, did I mention 1,000? Was it 1,000 I said? Okay, 1,000. The 900 shares is then sold back to the company at par value, at the very low initial acquisition price. So that's the point. That will be said in the shareholder agreement as a principle. and it will be said in the option agreement as a more specific clause. If you leave, non-vested shares will be sold back to the company at your own acquisition cost, for instance, par value. That's the point. So then the shares are available for the person who comes in instead of the person leaving, right? Which is of course the whole point of the mechanism. These option agreements also have a little twist to that. There are some penalties, for instance, if an employer breaks the law, then there are penalties. You can't even count on keeping the first 100 shares if you under certain circumstances. But that's small stuff versus the big principle, which is that non-vested shares are sold back at cost.
If Ivan is here with us, maybe he can tell us if that answers his question.
Yes, I'm here, if you can hear me.
Perfect.
The question was actually related to the vested shares, the shares that he already received. So let's say that he exits after 1 or 2 years, and as a company, we would like not to have former employees still owning shares. So I heard that there are exit clauses that you could put in. But the question is, what's fair practice on that? Because obviously, if you don't have a new round of funding, you don't have a quoted price at that stage. And so how do you deal with that?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, some agreements deal with that in the way you say that even vested shares not required to be bought back, but the way to do it is that the company has an option to buy vested shares. Then of course it has to be fair because you actually earn that money, right? So it's usually market value or 80% of market value, and it says that if conventional market value cannot be measured, it's done at the last equity issue price, times a factor of 1 or 0.9 or whatever, or it can even be a linear function between the last two. It could be anything basically, but the point is to give the employee a fair price for vested shares at the same time as you make these shares available for others, because you don't want many passive investors. Back to that principle. So it's balancing that. So was that a sufficient answer to your question?
Yes, it was. Thanks a lot.
Okay, very good.
Thank you. Guy, are you here with us? Because that's quite a long, detailed question. So if you're here, you can jump into the conversation and ask it directly. Okay. If not, his question was, what would be the relevant number of shares to a key person? And I know his case. So basically, he's been running the company for 2-3 years, and now he has a key person coming in who's helping him with the company, and it's a researcher. And he's wondering what would be, yes, a good incentive for this person. So his question was, what if that person comes to become a co-founder? How do you consider her entry? Is that person receives a salary and other founders not to? So it's a bit complex question. How to compensate effort from other founders over time?
Yeah, okay, but it's not that complex. I mean, somebody comes in and you pay them 400,000 kroner a year because that's what you can afford. The market price for that person is 800,000 a year. So you have to provide some value of the missing 400,000, right? And then in addition, there is risk. So maybe I say to myself, okay, that person is valuable to me. The market price of that person is 800,000 a year. Basically, he loses for 400,000 by joining the company and receiving 400,000. So maybe I need to have an incentive package of 600,000 to 800,000 to be sure that I keep this person in addition to the 400,000. And there you go. then you basically translate this monetary incentive principle again into ownership that I started off by saying earlier. So basically, 600,000 or 800,000 a year over 3 years, then you have to provide a reasonable incentive package in the order of a couple of million, right? Something like that, to make up for the difference. So I would recommend to attack the problem that way. And say that, okay, this is the size, the necessary size of the incentive package. I can do it by shares, I can do it by options, I can combine it in some way, which we haven't talked about, but that makes a lot of sense actually, to sometimes combine it. You can't vote in a company with options, but you can vote with shares. So there's something to be said about mixing packages too. So basically, you create the mechanism that way. You measure. Sounds very quantitative, but you understand the way I'm thinking about this. Measure the difference versus market price and versus this person's alternative opportunities. Translate that into a necessary incentive package and implement it either by options or by direct shares.
I think, and I know that the challenge that he has in this case is that sometimes it's also difficult. In theory, it works, right? In theory, we can have this hypothesis and come up and discuss about the marketplace, market price and compensations. But on the other side, you can have founders who want to negotiate other things that don't make sense for the founder. So that's the challenge that he has.
Can you give me a specific example of what you meant by that, Raya?
Well, I wish he was here to really give us some details. But he has this person coming into the company, and he is paying her. He is not getting paid. He's been building the company, and this person wants a significant amount of equity in the company, and he's struggling in that negotiation because he's paying her a very good salary. He's not being paid. And for him, it also feels like that he's going to give away, if this person wants more than 20%, he's giving away a lot while he's paying her and he's been building the company. But that person feels that as a co-founder, even if the person didn't come in the early years, feels that as a co-founder, she needs to have a significant amount of equity.
Yeah, and that can be fair, but if I were to kind of design a package like that, I would certainly using the non-linear vesting principles to be sure that if such a person is proving out to be right and actually delivered, yeah, it's fair. If it turned out to be not so great, I don't kill my ownership structure. So. But it's a little hard to be too specific. Yeah, but
so let's go to another question.
More than willing to mail me a question. I'll try to answer it based on a little more facts.
Yes, we have many other questions. So let's go to Gorg. Any thoughts on issuing AB shares for employee scheme versus investors? Where you covered that a little bit. Is there anything else to add to that?
Which question was that?
It's from Gorg saying, any thoughts on issuing A and B shares for employee schemes versus investors?
Yes. Well, with investors, the point is, there are a couple of ways. Interesting principle about B shares, voteless shares. Because the point is that you don't want B shareholders to interfere in the business. That is that test kind of is well founded regarding small type crowdfunding shareholders. We talked about that already. There are a couple of other cases by which it could be useful to have it that way. Let's say you're providing services for a bank, and the bank wants to become a shareholder, and you're going to sell business. You're going to sell your software to other banks. Not a great situation, because the alternative banks might say, hey, I don't want to buy your stuff if the primary bank is basically holding 20% of your shares in your company. How can I trust even that the things are confidential? Well, in terms of these kind of industrial conflicts, so to speak, you can use B shares. You can say to the bank that, yeah, you can become shareholders, but it has to be B shares. you cannot use your ownership to influence the situation, and you will not be on the board. Is there a conflict on that? Not really. If you write things the right way, I can say, for instance, that. But if the company is sold, the B shares are immediately converted to A shares. So you get the same exit price as everybody else. I just don't want you to interfere in the business as things develop. So it can be used in a creative way to bring in investors or partners that you really don't want to, for good reasons, to interfere in your business, but you want to give them financial incentives. So the B shares is a financial vehicle designed to give people financial incentives without giving them formal influence. Is that applicable to employees? Yeah, sometimes it is. If you have many employees, it's a good idea also to give them B shares. They're not concerned. They're concerned with money usually. They're not concerned with going to the General Assembly and raise their hand, because they can raise their hand in their line management role. So yes, it can also be used to give incentives to employees, at least kind of on a broader scale, and then have the same rules for them. When the company is sold, the B shares are converted to regular shares, meaning that everybody gets the same exit price. So it's a good question. There's a little complicated mechanisms, but yes, it's applicable to a number of situations.
We have another question from Knut. In what situations do you recommend that a company buys its own shares?
People leaving is the obvious answer to that. For startups, the most relevant situation for buying own shares is when somebody's leaving and you buy up the non-vested shares, which was distributed initially because you had reverse vesting. Okay, so if you use reverse vesting, you sell somebody 10,000 shares, they leave after 2 years, 8,000 shares is not vested, I can buy them back. That's the most obvious applicable example on that. Large companies buy back their own shares for all other reasons. For instance, to get rid of small shareholders. Yeah, so back to this disadvantage of having many small shareholders. We can get rid of them by buying them up. Who shall buy them up? The company itself. So and companies do that because they don't want to have the hassle of handling hundreds of shareholders only blowing up their general shareholder meeting without providing much value. So there are other reasons as well.
Thank you. Marika had a question. Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm. Can I have one follow-up question, Ketil, on this one? Because if the company will buy back, would you use the share price at the time, or the actual cost that the employee has been given these shares?
Well, that depends on the agreement. So if you're buying back non-vested shares, they're being bought back at cost, meaning what the employee bought them for. So if you sold share to the employee at par value, 1 krone per share, non-vested, you buy them back at 1 krone per share. Yeah. If you buy back shares based on that are already vested for the purpose of not creating passive shareholders, completely different motive, then of course you buy them back at fair value so that the employee gets the money that he or she deserved. It depends on the situation. So there's not one answer to that. It really depends on, in the employee case, if the shares are vested or non-vested.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, we had Marika who asked, are there other kind of incentives you can give to investors in place instead maybe of equity, some preferential treatments?
Yes, the answer to that is yes, there are. So at least a couple of situations which sometimes there are investors that really can provide value to the company, and you want them to provide that value, and it's asymmetric. One investor stand out, and the other one you're not interested in. So of course you can write an option agreement with that investor and say, I want your services, I want to use it as a coach, and I'm providing you an option package. So basically, every month or every quarter, you do this for me, you'll get X options. You can do that. I would play with open cards about it. Should be in the cap table. So whether you're distributing ownership or options should both be listed in the overview of ownerships, which is called a cap table for a company. So it's open, it's transparent, nothing hidden. So that's one that's one way to think about it. There's another situation too, which I think is pretty interesting, and that is, when you're doing an equity issue, it's usually truly a ketchup bottle effect. Sometimes it's very hard to get the first investors to commit. And investors, have master's degree in basically not making decisions, to put it, So, and the situation is very asymmetric in the sense that it pays off for an investor to delay, because the more they delay, the more information they can get, and the easier, the easier it is to basically have more information per krone invested. To cut through that, basically a very tough situation, you can use incentives for early investors, which is not a bad idea, and I think many startups should do that. So you're raising 5 million. You have a hard time to get somebody to commit, and you say that for investors that commit in June, you will give 20% of the investment amount will come in addition. We will have options for 20% of the investment amount in addition. For investors committing in August, we'll get no such preference. And by doing it that way, you can have kind of early bird incentives, or sometimes it's called equity kickers, special incentives usually provided by options to make early decisions made, which then provides the basis for all the others saying yes afterwards, because everybody's looking at everybody, and that's why you have this ketchup bottle effect, which is important sometimes to manage.
Thank you, Marika. I hope this answers your question. We have next is Oystein. Can you elaborate on your advice against crowdfunding? Fragmented ownership will kill you, you said.
Yeah. Well, if you haven't implemented any of these mechanisms that I mentioned, either a feeding company or an AB share regime, good luck with having your general assembly with 150 invitations and managing that cap table. There are automation tools regarding this for sure, but this will create a tremendous bureaucracy for you. Basically, everything will take more time, and that's not what you should use your time on. Point one. Point two, investors don't like that you basically are reserving a certain portion of your time to handling bureaucracy when you don't have to. So, and the more professional investors are, the less they like it. So sometimes there are some good reasons for doing it. I realize that, but if you do it either through AB shares. When you have AB shares, basically in the crowdfunding sense, means that if you invest more than X, you get A shares. If you get less, you get B shares. Okay, so they can choose. So automatically you place the small investors into the B share category. Either do it that way or do it through a feeding company to avoid bureaucracy and to avoid disattraction from later professional investors who want you to spend your time on marketing strategy and sales, not to handling a large inventory of investors. Some of them might be quarreling, some might pose you questions. What happens if 150 shareholders, 10% of them post you a question by mail every week? What are you going to do? Sit over the weekend and answer them? It's not a good idea. But if you have to have the capital, of course, but then implement one of these two alternative anti-bureaucratic measures.
Okay, thank you. So we have one last question. From Lynn, what do you think of giveaway shares to get a design company, for example, like Hades, for example, to provide crucial services on identity communication? How is an investor view on the benefit or drawback of this?
Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with paying for services through equity. Provide things you should think about in that regard. So again, you can do it by issuing equity, or you can do it by issuing options. If you're doing by issuing incentives like options, you try to build the price of your company as things go along. If you had a private placement in January this year of 100, you should try to place incentives at 105, 110, 115 to basically build up under the capitalization and the development of your company. As long as you do that, as you think that way, most investors will just clap their hands and say it's great, no problem with that. So it can work.
Okay, so did I cover all the questions? Please let me know in the chat very quickly. You might have time for one last question. And if, let me see here. Okay, I see more questions. Okay, from Ara, what do you spend your free time with? Could you name one thing activity you love? He wants to get to know you.
I'm a music freak, so I have been music all my life. So I play a few instruments and listen to all kinds of music, from prog rock to jazz to funk to anything basically.
Thank you, Ara, for the question. Alyosha, if we have an equity option, can we set it up with KPIs instead of time span?
Yes, you can. You can, any criteria can be, again, KPIs of any type. So it's a matter of negotiating with the recipient of these options and just decide. You can mix it too. You can say that X percentage of it should be event independent or performance independent, and why the rest should be by reaching certain KPI. Sure.
Fantastic. Thank you.
It's a good idea, by the way. But from the person's point of view, it might be perceived as fair if you mixed it in some reasonable way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for everyone for your questions. Thank you so much, Ketil, for joining us, taking the time to prepare this, answering the questions. Now, those who need some documents, I am going to ask you, please send me a request to Raya. I'm leaving my email here, raya@thefactory.no, so I can start mapping what type of documents you need exactly. We'll try to gather them and send them to you. And over the summer, maybe we will try with the factory to put them on our website. We will find a way. But if you need something urgently, send me an email and I will figure it out for you. Okay? Thank you so much.
Thank
you. Do you have any final? Yeah.
No, I just want to say I'm going to mail you now within the next 15 minutes. I made you the presentation so you can distribute it, and yeah. It was fun. I enjoy to get questions like this, and I kind of try to answer them too. So it was enjoyable for me certainly. So I appreciate it.
For me too, and I think for everyone who stayed with us till the end. Thank you so much, and have a nice summer. Otherwise,
have a great day. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Have a great summer.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.